The crisis in Ukraine. What vested interest does Russia have, and where do the seeds of animosity come from? In Africa, more devout Muslims are killing people who don't agree with the Muslim religion. And the Arizona legislature has moved to protect Christian business owners from the dictates of the Muslim religion and other false religions. This is the voice of resistance.
Standing for truth in the four corners of America. Fighting for justice on the frontiers of the culture wars. And turning resistance into an art form. Randall Terry.
Our hearts go out to the dear people of Ukraine who are in the midst of what we pray does not become a violent transition to a new government. This is about two things. Today, it's about two things. It's about today and about yesterday. It's about gas and it's about starvation. Now, as you know, the former president has been voted out of office, 380-0 from the Ukrainian parliament. Viktor Yanukovych, as of this taping, his whereabouts are unknown. He fled, he tried to get out of the country on a plane, they wouldn't let him leave. He went in a car and then he dismissed his own bodyguard because he was afraid that they might detain him. Meanwhile, former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko has been released from prison. She was sentenced to prison in 2011 for charges of being involved in some type of embezzlement or economic scam involving Russian gas that came into Ukraine and that also passed through Ukraine. All right, so as I said, this is about two things, yesterday and today. Let's start with today. Today, Russian gas pipelines pass through the Ukraine, providing natural gas not only to the Ukrainians, but also to Czechoslovakians, to Germany, to Poland, and to Italy. The gas that comes from Russia, as far east as Siberia, fuels most of Europe. Now, nations like France and the United Kingdom and other countries throughout Western Europe have gas that reaches them through nations other than Ukraine. But for the nations that I mentioned, most or all of their gas comes directly through Ukraine. So when I say this is about today, Russia needs the money and Europeans need the gas. Russia is simply not going to abide by an anti-Russian government emerging in Ukraine. And so, will Putin militarily intervene? Will they cut off gas to Ukraine to starve them out in the dead of winter? Well, that leads me to yesterday. You may remember from some of your history books that when the communists took over Russia, the Ukrainians thought, hey, this is our chance to be free, because they had been dominated for a couple hundred years by Tsarist Russia, by the Tsars. And Ukraine was considered the breadbasket of Europe, right? The land was so fertile and the crops were so numerous and the farming was so prosperous that they fed literally millions of people far outside of the borders of Ukraine. Well, Russian communists, determined to keep control of Ukraine, began to starve out its inhabitants in the 1920s. And when some Ukrainian communists asked the communists in Russia, hey, lighten up just a little bit, about, multiple thousands of them were actually deported. That some were just shot, some were imprisoned. So this went on during the 1920s. Lenin started to relax things, but then Stalin came to power. When Stalin came to power, he was determined not only to break the back of any hopes of Ukrainian independence, but also to lie to the entire world. Anybody inside of Ukraine that even used the word starvation or hunger in any correspondence whatsoever could be arrested, perhaps shot on sight. I'm going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to do a quick history lesson of what the Ukrainian people endured yesterday, and hopefully give you an understanding as to why they, some of them at least, are so filled with hatred toward their Russian masters, former masters, because they had a resistance. This is the voice of resistance, at least here for America.
You have two choices. I mean, you can try to raise your children by design, or you will raise them by default. There are no perfect parents. We're going to get it wrong sometimes. If we have a plan, we've got a better chance of getting it right in the long run.
There is something deep within the heart of every human being that longs for parental acceptance and approval. When does a boy become a man?
Get a group of guys around and ask them that question.
I don't think there's a certain age. Some men stay boys their whole life.
I would say, 16, 18 years old.
Wow, that's a good question.
When they get bar mitzvah.
Well, I think when he has a child. So I just became at 56, 56 years old.
Without the power of the Holy Spirit changing us and giving us power over our sin, we can't hope to be the dads that our kids need us to be.
Consider being a mother so desperate to keep her child alive that she literally would take her emaciated child near a railroad track, and with the best of her timing and with the little strength she had left in her starving body, she would throw her child onto a passing train. That is how bad things were in Ukraine during Stalin's successful effort to starve them to death. If somebody was found with so much as an ear of corn or a stalk of wheat, they could be shot on sight. At least 10 million people, perhaps 3 million of them children, were starved to death by the Russian communists between 1932 and 1933. Stalin was a genius at propaganda. He had a former French prime minister travel to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, on a 5-day tour, carefully staged. And he went and told the Western press, I didn't see any hunger, I didn't see any starvation, things are great. People in the Ukraine were sneaking out messages to their family members and friends that were in the West saying, we're starving. They risked their lives to send the message out. People in America, Canada, other European nations were sending money back, or rather were sending foodstuffs to Ukraine to feed their friends and relatives. Communist authorities would stop the food at the border and let none of it in to the people. After these poor souls had perished with hunger, Stalin then repopulated Ukraine with Russians. Some of them undoubtedly might have moved willingly, some of them were forced to move. The reason that you will hear in news broadcasts that the eastern portion of Ukraine is more favorable to the Russians is because they are of Russian descent, and they came and took over the homes and the farms of people who were starved to death by Stalin's decree. Those of you from an Irish background can think about the times in your sad history where the English literally starved portions of Ireland to death and then sent Scots or English to live in the abandoned homes. When we think of these horrific images, most of us cannot imagine the generational grudge, the deep-seated hatred for the sons and the grandsons of those who starved the parents and the grandparents to death. And so the question is, will Ukraine form a new government that is leaning towards Russia, leaning to the east, or leaning to the west? One bit of good news is that this does not involve Islamic terrorists. All right? This is about the 22-year-old government of Ukraine wanting to have in power a president, prime minister, officials who are not corrupt and who will hear the cries and the voice of the people of Ukraine. And so the former president, who is now hiding, he was voted out 380-0 by the Ukrainian parliament. Who's going to become the next head of state? The former prime minister has been released from prison. She is expressing interest in running for president. Elections are set for May. So the question is, as I mentioned in the last segment, what will Russia do? Will they send in the military now? That would be a PR disaster for them, especially after how well things went with the Olympics. Will they starve the Ukrainians of gas? Well, the historic echoes that I've discussed involving Stalin starving people to death would haunt Putin and haunt Russia. So that's unlikely that they will do that. It would provoke far too much sympathy from the West. In my opinion, the easiest thing to do for the Russians is just to wait. Just wait. Because if Julia Tymoshenko is elected to become the next president of Ukraine, well, she has had favorable relationships with the Russians. I mean, after all, she was put in prison for her part in a Russian gas deal. She understands that Ukraine needs the Russian pipelines as much as Russia needs the pipelines to pass through Ukraine and to provide Europe with gas. So we will keep you updated on this, and I encourage you to pray for the people of Ukraine, that there is no more bloodshed and that they can proceed forward in what are their best interests under God, with life and justice defined by Him, not by communist or socialist or any other ist from Russia or from Ukraine, for that matter, or from America. This is the voice of resistance. Do you want to have knowledge, wisdom, discernment? If so, you have to read good books on theology, history, books that look at the lives of great men and women. So to help you to become a more effective Christian, a better witness for truth, somebody who can engage in productive conversation that exhorts and edifies those that you speak with, we're going to do something crazy. We're offering you these 7 books for a gift of any size. You just pay for the shipping and handling, and then give whatever gift that you can, and we will send them to you. But just to make it a little bit more crazy, I will send you a second copy of my 3 books, autographed. You can give them as a gift to your pastor or to a family member and help extend truth and justice in the world. This is while supplies last. Devout, sincere Muslim men following in the footsteps of their beloved prophet Muhammad. These Muslim men, part of a group known in Nigeria as Boko Haram, have set fire to a good number of buildings at the at the Federal Government College in Nigeria. The name Boko Haram means, loosely translated, Western education is forbidden. As of this filming, at least 59 young men are dead. What the Muslims did was they went onto the grounds at about 2 a.m. and they sealed the dormitories where the boys were and set the buildings on fire. When some of the boys were able to break a window and try and get out, they were captured and had their throats cut or were shot. The females that were at the college campus were told that they could leave, but that they needed to quickly forsake their goal of any type of Western education or the influence of Western education, and that they should either be or remain good Muslim ladies and to marry a fine, devout Muslim man. Nigeria is approximately 50-50 Muslim versus Christian. The Christians are dominant in the southern half of the country, which also has a lot of oil fields, and the Muslims are predominantly in the north. Nigeria has the largest population of any country in Africa, and it is without question the current and probably next hotbed for Islamic militants, devout Muslim men following in the footsteps of Muhammad. And it's probably the next hotbed for Muslim training to become what we would call terrorists. And also, it's going to figure in as a significant source of revenue to fund these people. Listen to me. Kidnapping in Nigeria right now is a multi-million-dollar business. The president's uncle, 7 hours ago, the press reported, a day after these children were slaughtered in cold blood, the president's uncle was kidnapped as people, his devout Muslim captors, are going to undoubtedly come forward and demand money. I believe the interior minister's mother of Nigeria was kidnapped about a year ago and was released after a week. It's a multi-million-dollar business. And again, for those of you not familiar with the Muslim narrative, let me explain something to you. Christianity has its founder, Jesus Christ. And in the narrative of Christianity, we seek to follow him, his example, and the example of the early church, the apostles, the disciples, the 120 in the upper room, etc. All right? The Muslims have a narrative. They have their founder, Muhammad, and they have the first caliphs, all right, the rightly guided successors of Muhammad, and they have the companions of the prophet, as they call them. So just as we study the life of Christ and the life of the early church and the life of the apostles to best understand how God wants us to live and who he wants us to imitate, the Muslims have their narrative. They have their history. They have their examples. And in the lifetime of Muhammad, slaughters such as we have just witnessed in Nigeria were common. And they weren't simply for the sake of executing some type of vengeance on those that they were killing. They were specifically to instill fear into the hearts of the living so that they would become Muslims. Likewise, ransoming kidnapped victims or prisoners of war was part and parcel of Muhammad's life and the example that he set and that his companions set. And so a devout Muslim man capturing someone and then demanding money for them to be released, he can look up toward whoever he's looking to and tell himself that he's following the example of Muhammad. When you hear somebody say that Islam is a religion of peace, remember these things. This is the voice of resistance. My wife and I, for 5 years, have been grinding our own wheat and baking our own bread from scratch. Within 2 hours, you can have fresh wheat in your hand and then piping hot bread come out of the oven. The most nutritious and delicious bread you will ever have. And we do it for under $1 a loaf. Call Paula's Bread and find out about this grain mill and the mixer and how it can save you money and change your life. What does freedom of religion mean to you in America, specifically in regards to helping devout Muslim men who want to promote Sharia law? Let me give you an example. Let's say that you were the pastor of a church and a group of devout Muslim men who believed in Sharia law, hook, line, and sinker, and thought that a Muslim man should be able to have multiple wives, that a Muslim man should be able to marry a child bride, a 9-year-old girl, as is common in many Muslim nations. And they came to you and said, we want to rent your church and have a rally on behalf of Sharia law. You could say no. The law would protect you. Now, what if one of the men in your church or one of the women in your church had a fabric store, and they came in and said, we're going to buy fabric to adorn a big meeting hall, and we're going to promote Sharia law, and we're going to explain to the community the benefits of having 4 wives, the benefits of having child brides, and we want to buy material from you. And you said, no, I don't want your money. I want nothing to do with it. I've seen what Sharia law has done to millions of Christians around the world. Thank you. I respectfully decline, and now you can leave. Well, if you did that, you could be sued for discrimination. In other words, the church buildings are protected, but not church businessmen. Here's what freedom of religion means in one of our state's laws. It says, exercise of religion means the practice or observance of religion, including the ability to act or refusal to act in a manner substantially motivated by religious belief. So there's the protection for a church. The problem is that persons are not covered, individuals. And so this state is saying, well, let's revise who's protected. They're saying, quote, a person includes a religious assembly, so there's your church or institution, any individual, association, partnership, corporation, church, religious assembly, or institution, or other business organization. So the Arizona legislature, which is where this is coming from, is simply amending the bill to say that if you have a deeply held religious belief, you cannot be forced to participate in a business transaction if the religious practices and their declared intentions are in violation of what you hold sacred. All you have to be able to prove is that a person's action or refusal to act is motivated by a religious belief, that the person's religious belief is sincerely held, and that the state's action to prosecute you would substantially burden your exercise, the exercise of the person's religious beliefs. So I have to be able to prove. Would you support it in that situation? I mean, doesn't that just make sense? I don't believe in 4 wives. I don't believe in child brides. I don't believe in the assault on Christianity that is inherent to Sharia law. Well, the Arizona legislature has passed these words. The question is, will the governor of Arizona sign it? Well, she's under a lot of pressure to not sign it from guess who? The militant homosexuals. They want to be able to sue a Christian businessman who won't make them a wedding cake or sell them the cloth to adorn their so-called wedding. Friend, by the way, in case anyone is wondering, yes, I am comparing militant Muslims imposing their view of marriage on a Christian business to homosexuals imposing their view of marriage on a Christian business. Both are an assault on the Christian definition of marriage, and both must be resisted, and a Christian business owner should be protected if he says, I'll have no part of it. Go get him, Arizona. you.